This morning's topic is largely ignored by Unitarian Universalist communities, but it's tremendously important. I want to talk about followership this morning. Where in our lives are we followers? What makes a good follower, and how can we leverage the power of followership to further our core values? Some of you are probably thinking, we're not that kind of faith community. We tend to not think very highly of followers. In fact, the word is a bit of an insult. It suggests a lack of originality or perhaps a certain laziness. Tapestry's own vision specifies that we aim to be a leader in South Orange County. Leadership is all well and good. The fact of the matter is, all of us are followers in various associations. Followership might include a position in a congregational life or a homeowners association or city residents or as a member of a nonprofit, in your families perhaps, or the broader political world, local, state, national, international. Probably at work, you're a follower. Some of us have had the privilege or responsibility to be in a leader position in some of those arenas. Still, most of us spend most of our time as followers. I want to start with a look at followership from the Buddhist tradition. Buddhism is somewhat different from other religions. If you've been up on your reading on our neighboring faiths class, you learned this recently. The goal and the measure of truth in Buddhism is based squarely in this life, everyday experience. You're probably familiar with the Four Noble Truths in Buddhism. In this life, there is suffering or dissatisfaction. Clinging or attachment is the root cause of that suffering. There's a way to escape the suffering. And fourth, the Eightfold Path is the core teaching of Buddhism is the way out of that suffering. It's all about having less suffering, here and now. So practitioners are invited to try on Buddhist ways of thinking. Try for yourself, living according to the teachings. If you find the teachings are true, then stick with it. The Buddha was very clear. The teachings are only true to the extent that they're able to reduce suffering in the world. There's no claim that this is the single truth or way. There's no claim that Buddhism was handed down from a divine being. Rather, the Buddha said, this is what I found works. Give it a spin, see if it works for you. Be lights unto yourself. But be warned, it's very hard to let go of what we thought we knew. Often, we're more inclined to cling to the suffering and the discontentment that we know, rather than open our eyes to a new and happier way of being, because we really like what we think we know. The Buddha told a story to his students. He said, a young widower was devoted to his little son. But while he was away on a business trip, the father, some bandits came and burned the whole village to the ground and kidnapped his little boy. When the father returned, he found only ruins, and he was utterly heartbroken. He thought that the charred remains of another child were his own, so he organized a small funeral and collected the ashes and carried them on his way. One day, though, somehow, the son managed to escape from the bandit kidnappers and made his way back to the home. In the meantime, his father had rebuilt the house. When the boy arrived late one night, he knocked on the door. His father, kneeling at the altar he had made to memorialize his son, called out, "Who's there?" "It's me, your son." "Please, Papa, let me in." The father, still burdened by the grief thought that this must be some wretched boy making fun or being cruel. He shouted, "Go away! Leave me alone, my son is dead." The boy knocked again and again, calling for his father to open the door and let him in. The father, refusing to answer the door, kept calling out, "Go away! Leave me alone in my grief." And at last the boy gave up and went away. After he told this story, the Buddha added, "If you cling to an idea as the unalterable truth, then when the truth comes and knocks at your door, you'll not be able to open the door and accept it." In Buddhist tradition, the proof is in the pudding. We're called to follow the teacher or the teachings that improve our lives. But that calls us to the very difficult work of discernment, occasionally letting go of what we thought we knew, and that is hard. A good portion of this reflection on followership comes from a book by Barbara Kellerman called Followership: How Followers Are Creating Change and Changing Leaders. Now, this is all written for the business world, but man, does it make sense for where we are today. A follower can be defined by their behaviors. That's what we may think of when a follower does what they're told and follows the leader. Or a follower can be defined by a position or rank. Followers are lower in the hierarchy and have less power, less authority than their superiors. It's this second type of followership that I'm interested in exploring today. In the effort to understand followership, there are roles we sometimes play. It can help to look at the spectrum of levels of engagement. Barbara Kellerman talks about 5 different levels of engagement. I think that's kind of arbitrary. You could probably have more of a spectrum, but 5 is kind of helpful. The lowest level of engagement are isolates. As the name suggests, these are people that know nothing and have no involvement with what's going on, either supporting or negating their leader. They just do their own thing. But by default, by knowing nothing and doing nothing, isolates strengthen the leader who already has the upper hand. The example that comes to mind is the role that many of us might play with a homeowners association. Most of us are simply grateful that someone else is willing to be on that board. And we're sure that they're doing a good job, whatever that is that they're doing. Sometimes we choose not to know. The second category of involvement or engagement is the bystanders. Bystanders observe, but still choose not to participate. They make a deliberate decision to stand aside, to disengage from what their leaders are doing. And that withdrawal, this attempt at neutrality, in the end amounts to tacit support of whatever the status quo is. Voter turnout might be a good example of bystanders. Voter turnout is, I was really interested to learn, has actually been much higher in recent years than it had been in the United States. Globally, the United States is somewhere around the middle in terms of voter turnout, but still, for whatever reason, some folks just don't vote. It's not that they don't know what's happening, they just choose to sit it out. The third category of follower is participants. As the name suggests, participants are in some way engaged. They clearly favor their leader and the groups, or they are clearly opposed to that leader or group. In either case, they care enough to put some time, some money, some resource into their opinions. They're invested with some level of action. I think it's sort of like identifying as middle class. I imagine most people see themselves as participants in their systems, but that may not be the most accurate picture. I would venture to say that many Americans are finding themselves shifting from a category of bystander into participant these days. As I mentioned, voter turnout has been higher recently. People are perhaps calling or writing their congressional representatives for the first time. It's encouraging to see. The participants are often organized or inspired by a fourth level of follower, that's the activists. Activists feel strongly about the issue. They are energetic and eager and engaged because they're heavily invested in people and the process. They work hard, either on behalf of their leader or to undermine that leader. And the final level is diehards. As the name implies, they are prepared to die if necessary for a leader or to overthrow a leader. Obviously, this is all-consuming. This type is rare and extreme, but it is very real in the world. So let me name those 5 categories again. Isolates, bystanders, participants, activists, and diehards. With the spectrum of involvement, I want to keep a couple of things in mind. First, the spectrum of engagement describes action, not an espoused identity. Here's my example. For Thanksgiving this year, I was with family. Over and over again, the topic of frustration with Donald Trump came up. This was before the inauguration, man. After several days, at our last night together, somehow my aunt got all excited and professed her willingness to lay down her life to protect queer people or immigrants, or maybe it was to protect a younger generation or protecting American democracy. I'm not sure exactly what her motivation was, but this is the important part. This profession of die-hard resistor status came from someone who had never participated in a protest, or spoken at a city council meeting, or even communicated directly with her representative about her concerns. Perhaps it was the margarita talking over dinner, or all of those hours spent in conversation. In that moment, my aunt professed herself as a diehard, when in reality she's more of a participant/bystander brand of follower. Part of self-awareness is being able to distinguish between the intensity of our feelings and the actions we actually take. Whether it's for ourselves or for understanding our friends and neighbors, it's useful to separate what people feel or say from what they actually do in the world. These levels of engagement are defined by action, not by self-labeling or momentary inspiration like my aunt. From what I've seen, some of the most centered, measured people are putting in the biggest effort to make change. Again, that's not just for politics, it's for all sorts of arenas of followership. The question of engagement isn't how you feel, but how you act on those feelings. The second point I want to make about the levels of engagement is there have been people on both sides of history in each of those levels of engagement. The classic example that always comes up in followership or trust is the Nazi rise to power and the takeover of Europe and the Holocaust. There were all sorts of bad people along the full spectrum of engagement. Isolates, bystanders, participants, activists, and diehards that enabled that horrific chapter of history. And across Europe, Among Jewish and other marginalized communities, and here in the United States, there were followers who resisted along that full spectrum of engagement. Some made small, consistent efforts. Others gave their lives willingly to stop that evil power. So far, I've sounded pretty neutral about those various levels of followers. But there are, in fact, good followers and bad followers. Remember, this was written about the business world, not necessarily the political world. But there are just two criteria for being a good follower. The first is about level of engagement. Some engagement is better than no engagement. Good followers take some action. The second requirement for being a good follower is about motivation. Being motivated by public interest is better than being motivated by self-interest. Some engagement is better than none, and a good follower has the public interest at heart. It sounds pretty simple and obvious. Supporting leaders who are ethical and effective is being a good follower. Opposing leaders who are not ethical or not effective is being a good follower. And this is important. Doing nothing, being an isolate or a bystander, is being a bad follower, according to her layout. Essentially, what it takes to be a good follower is a lot like what it takes to be a good leader. Good followers should be informed and energetic and independent. They have the capacity to deal with some complexity. They exercise judgment. And I know this sounds really overwhelming. I was hesitant to deliver this much today about followership. Given the overlapping networks and connections, those responsibilities to be good followers in all those arenas in life are just not possible to execute all of that well. It's not a guilt trip. This week I learned that I have a strong pull toward either being an activist or a bystander. I'm not very good at being a participant. For some reason, I avoid that type of bread and butter, low simmer, marathon type of followership. And in many ways, those participants, the ones who show up and do their part actively, sustainably, patiently, reliably, those are the folks that make the world go round. I offer you this look at what makes a good follower not as a guilt trip for anyone or to say you should be doing more. It's just a tool for seeing ourselves more clearly. Now, Unitarian Universalism has always been optimistic about our human nature. We believe that we humans have the capacity to make good decisions, even in groups. That's why we have supported the democratic process for a long time. It's not because it's an effective political tool, it's because it's really what we believe theologically and philosophically. So whether that means showing up prepared for our congregational meeting in June, or paying attention to the Orange County Board of Supervisors, or engaging in this bizarre circus of American national politics, engagement, being a good follower really matters to us. One of the key pieces of being a good follower is being well-informed. Being well-informed does not mean turning up the volume on your echo chamber. I'm going to go out on a limb and recommend two different news sources that I think make us better followers. One is Tangle. Jennifer Guy pointed this out to me recently because she said it helped her stay grounded and sane. Tangle describes itself as, quote, Independent, nonpartisan political news where you'll hear the best arguments from across the political spectrum on the news of the day, plus fascinating interviews with people in the political world. The only political news source trusted by people from all across the political spectrum. I've been listening to a few podcasts. Each episode or article focuses on one topic deeply, and they summarize what the right is saying and what the left is saying, and then the editor offers his 2 cents. The benefit of that format is we get to hear the facts that the right and the left sometimes leave out of their reporting. Jen pointed out that this source provides all sorts of context that's really important to understanding a story. You can read it online or get it emailed to you or listen to the podcast. The second source is a little bit geekier, but I think is really interesting. It's a podcast called Good on Paper. It's produced by The Atlantic. The host looks at public policy issues through the lens of actual measurable impact. I think she has a background in statistics, or at least she sounds like it. Here's how the podcast describes itself. Quote, "Have you ever heard a commonly held belief or a fast-developing worldview and asked, is that idea right or just good on paper? Each week, host Jerusalem Dimsus and a guest take a closer look at the facts and research that challenge the popular narratives of the day to better understand why we believe what we believe." Again, it's called Good on Paper, for a deeper dive on one public policy issue at a time. I think all of us are thinking more strategically about how to be good followers these days. That may be so that we can have a bigger impact. It may be to keep our blood pressure under control. Barbara Kellerman says that good followers has some level of involvement, and a good follower is motivated by public good, not just their own. You probably never thought you would hear it put this way. I certainly never thought I would be hearing it, but Unitarian Universalists are some exceptionally good followers. But our job is not yet done. Amen.